Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Elbridge A. Colby. Elbridge served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development, in which capacity he was responsible for defense strategy, force development, and strategic analysis for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And today, we will speak about his book, Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. Elbridge, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Ellen.
So, your title is a lot of things that I don't understand. So I wonder if we could start by you telling us about your background and how is it that you got into this position?
Sure. Well, thanks. Yeah, I've been working in the national security field, the U.S. national security field, most of my career for about 20 years, starting after college. I graduated from college in the early 2000s, and I worked in a variety of efforts, particularly in the intelligence reform effort after 9/11 and the Iraq WMD sort of imbroglios. And then I went to law school. I never practiced law, but I got more interested in strategic issues, particularly deterrence and arms control, nuclear weapons, and worked in kind of that, and then got more and more into defense. And so I worked in think tanks for a while, and then I was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development in 2017 under Secretary Mattis, and then worked there for a year and led the development of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And then I left the Pentagon. I've started a small co-lead a small think tank called the Marathon Initiative that's really focused on building on that work in a sense to try to develop strategies for an era of great power competition, particularly dealing with China.
And why is it that you were interested in national security since you were a young man?
That's a good question. I've had a number of family members who've been involved in U.S. national security issues, and so I guess I grew up abroad in Asia, mostly, largely, and so I've always been interested. And then I find strategy very interesting. It's I think obviously I think it's important. Not all strategies are important. In fact, many aren't. But in theory, it can be important. And intellectually, it's very challenging and rich area. It's not a matter of sort of rote memorization, and it's something where you can try to develop something new, and that's certainly what I'm trying to do here.
Okay, well, let's go then into the topic of the book. So after the Cold War, the United States came as this big superpower, but then the United States run into trouble. There was the Vietnam War, which didn't come out to be too good for them. There was a war in Iraq, which didn't have great results neither. And then lately, the war in Afghanistan, which after 20 years, I almost look from the outside that the United States came out empty-handed. I know there were a lot of good things that happened while the United States were there, but right now internationally, it doesn't seem like a stream of victories. And now we are facing a huge, the United States facing what is considered a true economic and military power. So I wonder first of all, how is the American public looking at this possibility, at this possible confrontation, and how prepares the United States?
Well, there's a lot in there. One thing I would say, and I think your points about those three wars, basically correct, but it has the tendency of underestimating the successes of American policy in those years, because more important than those wars were the wars that didn't happen. Particularly the war that didn't happen with the Soviet Union, because the Soviets were sufficiently deterred essentially by the United States not to take action. So, the United States has been like a prize fighter that nobody wants to challenge. And the wars that the United States has lost have been wars that were for relatively peripheral interests at the end of the day, and for goals that were very ambitious, and in my view, way too ambitious in the case of certainly of Iraq and Afghanistan, to try to transform another nation that's very distant from us. So ultimately, the United States just decided to give up, right? I mean, in all of those cases, it was a matter of willpower. Vietnam was more, I think, is a different level of magnitude than Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, the level of casualties, and the U.S. lost almost 60,000 personnel killed in Vietnam. I think it's about 1/20th, maybe 1/10 of that in Iraq and Afghanistan, respectively. So, and the North Vietnamese military was backed by the Soviet Union, so it was very well equipped, and so that was a little bit different. But even there, it was a matter of the United States deciding not to continue the war effort, which it had the power to do. China is very different. China is a superpower, and it could beat the United States outright in a fight over central interests, and which has never actually happened to the United States. I mean, most countries have lost a war about something fundamental in their, if not their recent history, within the last couple of centuries. I mean, if you look at the European states, obviously France, Germany repeatedly, Spain was defeated by the United States, Italy, of course, in the Second World War. Britain was defeated in our Revolutionary War, was a major defeat. It's never happened in the United States, actually. We've never been defeated. I mean, the southern part of the United States was decisively defeated in our Civil War, and that memory lasted for a long time. But for the first time, we have a superpower. I mean, it was possible that we would lose a war to the USSR, but they never risked it. Right. And now we have a country that is as large an economy as our own, which is the first time that's the United States is not clearly the largest economy in the world since the late 19th century. So this is a really significant shift. And one of the things I'm trying to do in my book is to get us to reckon with the gravity of the situation and the reality. And of course, also our close allies and partners like Canada to do so in their way as well. But that's really what needs to happen. And I continue to feel, I do feel that the national conversation in the United States is advancing, and it's getting better, but it's still not where it needs to be to deal with just how significant the rise of China. I mean, there's the classic line, you're never sure if Napoleon said it or any of these old adages, but Xi Jinping likes to quote it, that when China rises, the world will quake, he is supposed to have said 2 centuries ago. I think he was on the island of Elba, or on St. Helena. But here we are, and the world is quaking.
Wow. Okay. Well, there are 2 groups of people in the United States, the kind of people like you who is informed about military and international affairs. And then there is the average US consumer, and let's use that word because it has a particular meaning. So when you speak about defending Taiwan, and the consequences of that could be that our China imports could cost, I don't know, let's say 10% more, and that people will pay 20% more for the iPhone. I don't know how much there is an appetite for the average consumer for a defense strategy in Taiwan. I mean, for most people, they don't even know where Taiwan is. I mean, it's 7,000 miles away from the coast, while for the Chinese, it's a very important piece of land. I mean, it's small, but it's important to them, while the significant for the US consumer is not that much compared to their iPhones.
Well, look, you bring up a real issue, and I don't deny that. I mean, I'm not I don't expect the American people to make sacrifices that are ridiculous. I don't think that's the job of our national defense strategy, is not to ask the American people to do things that are. And I was actually having a debate last night with somebody who says that the way that we should respond to China taking over Taiwan is like a massive economic blockade, which would of course trigger the kind of consequences that you're talking about. And I think that's both. It would be very unlikely to work because the Chinese are so resolute, and it's not really being responsible to the American people, who deserve a better strategy. I mean, the United States is by far the most productive large economy in the world. They deserve a defense strategy that's not like stupid, like deserve something better. And But on the other hand, I mean, I don't think, it's my view, but I don't think Americans are or want to be are reducible or want to be reduced purely to consumers. I mean, I think, a couple points maybe before I go there. One is that I think it's in American self-interest to help defend Taiwan, not for Taiwan's own sake. I mean, Taiwan itself is not really important to the United States, but China dominating the world's largest market area definitely is. And, you talk about the iPhone. Well, I mean, Apple will be either gobbled up by a Chinese company, or there will be some Chinese company that will supplant Apple if China is dominant over the world's largest market area. And that's what's really at stake, is who is going to be is China going to be the hegemon of the world economy, or will there be two major poles represented by the United States and a balance? That's the basic question.
Right.
And I don't want to live in a world in which China, we know what Chinese dominated society is like, because we can see it in China. There's no privacy. All of your data is they use the power of data and of course government coercion and surveillance to coerce people, and that's their own citizens. So I mean, Chinese are famously nationalistic, so patriotic. So I don't know why they would treat us any better. So that's one thing. I think the stakes are worth it, and Taiwan is important to that because it's important to our geopolitical and defense position in Asia. The second reason is I don't think that Americans, are solely looking at their short-term consumption, right? I mean, if you look, Americans over the last year in particular, the perception of China as a threat has shot up in the United States, particularly among Republicans, but also Democrats. And support for coming to Taiwan's defense has also risen, because I think Americans intuitively understand that Taiwan and China are connected. And I would say, actually, a lot of kind of ordinary, quote unquote, ordinary Americans actually have felt the China challenge more acutely than some of the elites, because the elites have benefited from this sort of neoliberal approach to China, whereas the middle of the country, you've had deindustrialization. You see that in the politics in the United States, the opposition to trade, free trade agreements, the opposition to China. It's very politically significant now. So I think, that all said, I don't take it for granted, because defending Taiwan would be very, very difficult. So really what I'm trying to do with this book is try to develop a defense strategy that brings down the costs and risks to the American people of helping Taiwan defend itself, rather than having a strategy that's too costly, which will exceed their willingness to defend Taiwan. So that's the job of the defense establishment and defense strategy.
Well, I think your book has a very compelling argument, and it seems like everything that you talk about could be possible to defend Taiwan, assuming, of course, that there is a strong leadership in the United States. And in the United States, it seems right now there is everything except a strong leadership. I mean, we have the country being torn apart by two political camps. We have the abortion issues, we have race issues, we have mask versus anti-maskers, vaccine versus anti-vaxxers. I mean, the whole country is just cannot agree in anything. So for a whole country to say, okay, we can disagree about all these things, but we are all going to get together and defend Taiwan, the amount of bureaucracy, especially in the Pentagon, versus China that can build a hospital in 10 days, you have a top-down leadership, is also, I don't know.
Well, I mean, you make a good point about China's advantages. I mean, the advantage of an authoritarian system is it can move much, much faster. And, if you look historically, I think this is why large land powers on Eurasia have probably tended to be, authoritarian, because you need to move fast, because it's much easier to invade across land than it is across sea. That's why I don't think it's an accident that Great Britain and the United States are, traditionally the leading sort of, republic or constitutional monarchies, liberal systems in the world, because they have a moat, and a moat helps, So what you're talking about is actually, sort of pretty deep. Even the Fifth Republic in France, I mean, I think is to some extent a product of that need for a centralization of of power, at least in de Gaulle's perspective, I guess. But I would say, I mean, I think your point is too far. I don't, and at this point I hear very frequently about, is the United States capable? Are we too torn apart? Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, one, I don't think the evidence actually bears out that we are incapable of acting. I mean, I think actually, if there is one thing that Republicans and Democrats seem to have general agreement on, it's that China's a real problem. So, I mean, they're actually debating about who's better at taking on China, which is actually, in my view, is a good situation. So, and I mean, there's differences about what the nature of the threat is and how to deal with it, but okay. But I mean, there's pretty widespread agreement on the China challenge. So that's not, and I mean, you know, we're sailing ships in the South China Sea, and actually the Republicans and Democrats came together to vote an increase to the defense budget, basically about China, just this week. So I don't see the evidence. You know, the other thing is, from a political point of view, I mean, the political opposition is even more in favor of defending Taiwan than the administration is. So if there's a political pressure from the outside on the administration, it's to be more confrontational with China, not less. I mean, yeah, okay, Bernie Sanders and whatever, but like, you know, the actual political opposition is in favor of helping Taiwan. So the other thing is, you know, there's all this time. I mean, look, America has a lot of problems. I mean, but who doesn't? Let he who's without sin cast the first stone. You know what I mean? That's kind of my general view. But I would say, you know, if you look back historically, America has always been, there's this sort of idea out there that America has had this pristine and kind of very orderly past, like we were Denmark or something, or Canada, you know? I mean, no, we're not. I mean, it's the world of, like, you know, I mean, look at the 60s and 70s in the United States, mass crime wave, you know, race riots in the cities, riots in general, some of them race, you know, issues, but like, you know, huge social breakdown. And I mean, mass drug use, you know, Vietnam, disobedience over the draft and other things, you know, of course, Nixon's resignation, general breakdown in confidence in government institutions. And then like 10 years later, we defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So, I mean, it's, you know, and then if you look at the years before World War II, depression, large scale, you know, strikes and riotings. There was a Red Scare after World War I. There was the Bonus Army had occupied the Capitol, the ground in front of the Capitol, which was cleared out by the army. And then if you go back before World War I, you have mass labor unrest. I mean, crime, huge corruption in our cities, you know, like, so I don't know. It doesn't seem that out of whack from our general history. I mean, you have places like Vermont that are, you know, kind of tidy and whatever, but they're, you know, most of the country is pretty raucous. And I, you know, again, I don't want to understate what we're dealing with. I mean, there are definitely major challenges and problems in the United States, but I think this point doesn't really, I don't find it very persuasive. Not to mention, you know, I mean, let's look at our opponent, China. They have a lot of problems. And they have an authoritarian system that suppresses feedback loops for dealing with those problems, right? I mean, you don't have to, I'm not a super ideologue, but obviously if you have a centralized system where people are getting put in jail or shot, you're not necessarily going to get bad news come up the system. I mean, look, even what happened with COVID, right? I mean, it seems like they probably repressed information that was, you know, that affected us all, but I assume there are all kinds of feedback loops that aren't happening in the Chinese system because of that.
Okay, part of the book suggests to de-emphasize the military presence in other parts of the world, like the Middle East or whatever, and just focus on China. But at the same time, there is another country that is giving the United States problem, which is Russia with the possible invasion of Ukraine. I mean, so it's not like the United States and China are isolated in a world where nothing else is happening. I mean, there is Iran is still representing a threat. So I mean, it feels like a lot. It feels like a lot in the president's hands. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, you're right. Like there are other problems, but I don't think we have to prioritize. China's by far the biggest problem. We shouldn't. I mean, we should be reducing our forces in Europe. And one of the big mistakes this administration's making, and past administrations have not been very as successful as they could have been on this. It's hard, but it's to get the Europeans to do more, particularly the Germans. And actually, the Canadians could be doing more in Europe as they traditionally have. That's a disappointment, I would say. But I mean, personally, I'm sympathetic to the French position, which is that they want to take up more responsibility. The French have this tendency to talk about autonomy as if they're like deliberately trying to alienate us. But Europe has to do more. And by the way, Europe is fully capable of handling the Russia challenge, certainly the conventional forces challenge on its own. It's just they're just not doing it. The Germans aren't doing it particularly. I mean, the Poles are, the British are doing pretty well. The French actually do quite well. A lot of the Scandinavian countries, just the Germans are not pulling their weight and they refuse to do so. And at the end of the day, we can't do all of these things. So we have to make choices. We can spread the things around, and we will fail in Asia, which is the world's most important theater. And that's what the administration's saying they're going to put more troops in Europe, which is nuts. I mean, we passed the point where we could do this gracefully. So now we have to make a choice. And if we don't make a choice, we will be making the other choice. That's the reality. Wow. So, what we need to do is and this is one of the reasons that, I think I'm hopeful that my book has a reception in allied countries, including in Europe, it's very important they understand our overall geopolitical perspective and how we're thinking and how we're going to act. Because I think this tendency of the American government to sort of always be reassuring, obviously that wasn't necessarily the case under the Trump administration, but in general, our administration, our government's natural tendency is to go around and say, hey, everything's going to be fine, we'll be there. And I think that's actually misleading. And it undermines the incentives and the pressure on countries, again, particularly Germany, but others like, to some extent, Japan, although Japan is improving now, to take action that's necessary. And the longer we delay, the more severe the consequences will be. So my view now is we should be prepared to help the Ukrainians with lethal assistance and so forth and other kinds of assistance, but we should not commit US forces. And, we should back the Europeans who should, really the conventional forces should be the responsibility of the Europeans, which, by the way, was the original model of NATO as conceived by, say, Dwight Eisenhower and George Marshall, was not a permanent US large-scale conventional ground presence in Europe. And now we can't do it. So I don't know why, people, I get your point, and I understand where you're coming from, but people make that argument, well, they need to be understanding that they're making a choice to fail in Asia. And I would prefer to succeed in Asia and fail in other places because we can fix those things later. There's only so much the Russians can really do militarily, or the Iranians, but the Chinese, if they gain the dominant position in Asia, will all suffer, and it will not be reversible because they'll be too powerful.
I have so many questions, but I also I'm aware that of our time constraint. Let's just think about this. Well, when the United States invaded Iraq, the strategy was that it was going to be a quick war. We get in, we get out, the people are going to support us, and the American public is going to be happy because there would not be that many casualties. I wonder was the possibilities of getting in and out in China and having not that many casualties. I mean, China now has all these superpower hypersonic missiles, submarines. I mean, a huge navy. How do you see that playing out?
Well, let me say first, I think the decision to invade Iraq was a catastrophic mistake, and it will probably go down in history as I think it is possibly the worst decision the United States government has ever made. I mean, I maybe there are others that people can think of, but I don't know what they are. I've never been able to think of one. So it was a catastrophe, and it was a very, very different defense strategy than what I'm talking about. That was a strategy of domination and of regime change, of total ability to defeat and transform your opponent. Mine is denial. It's status quo and it's defensive. That was offensive and transformational. And it also used force to try to fundamentally resolve a political problem. And one of the things I bridle at is I don't like being called a hawk. because I've been a dove before, and sometimes, and I don't think that I'm a hawk, because I'm prepared to go to war. I'm prepared for us to go to war, but I don't want to, and I'm not trying to solve a political problem with force. So I'm trying to deter a war by being strong. So kind of the peace through strength model. So I don't like hawk or dove, but I would say in the case of China, no, it would not be costless. It would be probably very costly and exceptionally risky. The war could escalate, including to a thermonuclear war. So it could be extraordinarily devastating. Although I think that's unlikely, because both sides would have an interest in keeping the war limited. But the Chinese are incredibly powerful and sophisticated, and so I think we really need to be very careful. But again, what I'm trying to do is be as strong as possible and demonstrate. I'm a devotee of Clausewitz, the German military strategist, theorist, and Clausewitz said it's just, the best strategy is to be very strong. Now we can't just dominate the Chinese, but instead of having some clever strategy which may fail and which may have too much confidence in our ability, I'd rather just put our resources against this primary threat. So if the Chinese are saying, well, if I get to 80% confidence, I'll do it, but if it's at 79% confidence, I won't do it. It's what's the Shakespeare, for want of a shoe, the kingdom was lost. Like, let's not leave anything to chance. There's nothing that's going to happen in Ukraine or in the Middle East that's as significant as losing a war to China in Asia. And so that's where we need to cover down.
Well, Elbridge, I have so many questions, but we're gonna let.
I've gone on too long. I'm sorry, Alan. You're such a good interviewer.
We're gonna let the listeners go ahead, get the book, and
Thank you.
They be able to ask those questions and get the response right away from your book. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you do.
Sure, thank you. It's called The Strategy of Denial: American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. And I'll just say briefly, I think I've really enjoyed our conversation because it's more of a framework. It's not I don't intend it to be the last word on every subject, but more of a way of thinking about how, war and peace for us and our allies like Canada in a much different age in which we're not as powerful as we once were. And if you're interested, I have a lot of my work posted at our website, www.themarathoninitiative.org. Again, themarathoninitiative.org. And you can find and you can buy the book on Amazon or directly from Yale University Press if you prefer.
Elbridge, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Alain.